Welcome, everybody. This is pretty exciting to have this size crowd for one of our events. And I think you'll find it well worth your time, especially if you love trees, as you know, many of us do, as evidenced by the fact that we live in Guilford. So I'm going to give you a little pitch for the Land Trust before we start. The Guilford Land Trust is a volunteer-run nonprofit that acquires and conserves land in Guilford, and you're probably well familiar with our properties. We protect over 3,200 acres of conservation land in Guilford and manage many miles of trails. We are best known for our work in Westwoods and Bluffhead, but we have many other smaller properties. And I invite you to check out our website to learn about them. There are many maps for these properties on the website, by the way. We are a private organization that raises money from our members and through grants to buy land. We have been doing things the same way since 1965 with the support of our generous community. Right now, we are fundraising for $95,000 to cover the purchase of a 5-acre inholding in the Camp Meyer Preserve located off Westlake Avenue. If you'd like more information about the group, please make sure to leave us your contact information at that table there. So I am excited now to introduce our speaker, Elizabeth Ward, PhD, from the Agricultural Experiment Station in New Haven, and she's going to talk about various pests that are attacking trees in our communities. So Elizabeth, here you go.
All right, thank you all so much for having me tonight and for showing up. Can everyone hear me okay?
No.
No? I should use the microphone?
Yes.
All right, fine, I'll indulge you all. All right, so like was just said, I'm going to be talking about some pretty depressing topics tonight, tree stressors in Connecticut. So I'll try to keep the talk on the lighter end for at least some parts of it. But overall, I'm trying to leave you all with a positive message, is that there is a lot of bad things happening in our forests, but there are active ways that we can support our forests and manage them to help promote forest resiliency across the state of Connecticut. So like I was just introduced, my name is Elizabeth Ward, but I go by Eli. I'm a scientist at the Agricultural Experiment Station. I've been there for about a year and 8 months, since May 2023. My focus is on forest ecosystem ecology. My historic work has focused a lot on things like forest soils, invasive species, which I'm going to talk about tonight, and the effects of different changes in tree species composition on soil, carbon, and nutrient cycling. Another role that I have at the Agricultural Experiment Station is that I also coordinate Connecticut's Forest Health Program, which I'll talk about in a bit as well. And like I said, I've only been in this position for about a year and 8 months. But prior to that position, I was actually still living in New Haven because I did both my master's and my PhD at the Yale Forestry School. So even though I'm new in this position, I've been working and living in Connecticut's forests for a really long time now, and I've grown to love them, as all of you have. And so yeah, I'm excited to share some of the work that I've started in this new position with you all today. So who has not heard of the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station? Raise your hand. Just a few people? Who has heard of it, just as a test? All right, good. It's real then. All right, so I won't spend too much time talking about it. That's great that you all know about us. I always like to spend a little bit of time at the beginning of my talks promoting the Agricultural Experiment Station, because I always find it amazing that I did both my master's and my PhD at the Yale Forestry School less than a mile down the road, and knew very little about it when I was a graduate student. So as you all apparently know, we're a state research institution based in New Haven, Connecticut. And we also, in addition to research, which is our primary role in the state, we also do a lot of public services, which I'll just really briefly touch on here since you all are very familiar with us. just because we're a great resource. So all the statewide tick testing and surveillance, the mosquito surveillance throughout the state. We have a free soil testing program where you can drop samples off in New Haven and get them tested for things like heavy metals. And then we also have a bunch of different plant and insect disease information offices where you can drop off samples or send in inquiries with photos and get different information about things that are affecting trees in your backyard or plants in your backyard or other general inquiries. So there's a lot of great resources at the state, at our state agency, in addition to, like I said, our primarily research role. And then another great thing that we do, which is part of my research program, is that every year we do forest health surveys. And because I've only been in this position for, like I said, about a year and 8 months, I did my first aerial forest health survey last summer. And so this is a really cool thing that we do. This is the primary way in which we assess changes to Connecticut's forest conditions at the big ecosystem scale. Every summer we go on a series of flights across the entire state of Connecticut in this very small plane and visually map all major changes in terms of tree mortality, defoliation, discoloration, any major changes affecting the forests. And next year, for instance, because of our big wildfire season this past fall, we might be able to map some of the impacts that those fires have had. So just as an example of the type of impacts that we can observe through these aerial surveys, that middle picture I took this year, this last summer during the aerial survey, is showing oak mortality from spongy moth defoliation damage over the course of several years. Do you all know, raise your hand again, have you heard of spongy moth before? No. No, okay, so spongy moth is the first of many invasive pests that I'll be talking about tonight. This one's been around for a really long time, much longer than the other ones that I'm going to be talking about, which are primarily emerald ash borer and beech leaf disease. So it's actually been around in Connecticut since like the 1800s. It's been in North America since the 1800s, and then it was first detected in Connecticut in the early 1900s. And so typically spongy moth, which is an invasive pest from Europe, is kind of kept under control because there's actually a biological control agent present in the soils of Connecticut that's a fungus that's activated when we have these really wet springs. And so we go through periods where this pest is kept under control and then periods where we get these really bad outbreaks like you're seeing here. So since 2016, because of some major droughts that we had in 2015 and 2016, spongy moth, we've been having this series of outbreaks across the state that started with defoliation in the eastern part of the state and then has moved to the northwest corner. And so we're kind of hoping that it'll start to fizzle out as it continues to move across the state. But like I said, this is just one of many impacts that we're observing through these aerial surveys. And just one of the many impacts that Connecticut's forests are experiencing as well. Of course, I've talked a lot about invasive pests and pathogens, and I'll continue to talk about them throughout the talk. But we're also getting all sorts of other stressors as well, things like changing climatic conditions, increasing severity of severe storms, and other extreme weather events, changes in precipitation. We also have some problematic native species that are causing major damages to our forests, things like white-tailed deer. And then we also have the impacts of development on our forests, things like forest fragmentation and land use change and conversion for development. So there's lots of things happening simultaneously in these forests. And like I said, the big area of my research really focuses on invasive species and their impacts. So going back to our motto of the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station of putting science to work for society since 1875, I always like to start my talks by saying what specifically I do to put science to work for society. And at the broadest level, I address this question, which is how can we improve forest ecosystem health and resiliency in Connecticut? And so I'm going to start off by defining a couple characteristics of forest resiliency, at least in terms of what I think about when I'm thinking about promoting resiliency in Connecticut's forests. So the first is to maintain as many tree species as possible at the landscape scale across the state and our forests. And that's because there are a lot of changing conditions, many of which I just talked about, but there's a lot of unknowns in terms of what's going to happen in the future, what's going to be the next invasive species that's going to come and start to impact a different tree species. And so by maintaining all of the tree species at the landscape scale, you're kind of managing for what we ecologists call functional redundancy. If you lose one species, the hope is that there are other species that are present that can take on kind of the same functional role of the species that's lost, and as a whole, the ecosystem will continue to thrive. So managing for tree species diversity is the first major point I want to make in terms of defining forest resiliency. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time now talking about what diversity in Connecticut's forests looks like right now and how that's changing. So Connecticut is a really forested state, as you all see every day driving around. About 57% of the land is forested, and Connecticut's forests include about 58 different tree species. And there are a couple ways to talk about the composition of Connecticut's forests in terms of the most abundant species. And these different ways of identifying the composition of Connecticut's forests tell us different things about the forest, so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about it. So the first is that you can talk about the most abundant tree species by the volume of wood in the forest, basically, that tree species takes up. And this is a really good indicator of what the dominant tree species is in the overstory of the forest right now, because they tend to be the biggest trees that make up the most volume, that then are the major canopy trees in the forest. But another way to talk about the abundance of different tree species in the forest is literally by the individual number of stems in the forest, or the individual number of individuals. And that, of course, means that in order to be the most abundant species, you end up being much smaller. There ends up being many more small individuals but collectively they make up a large amount of the forest. So right now, in terms of the top tree species by volume, like I said, the top tree species in the overstory, red maple is the most abundant, followed by red oak, black oak, white pine, black birch, and white oak. And then in terms of the top tree species right now in our forest, in terms of stem count, the total number of individual stems, once again, red maple is the most abundant, followed by black birch, American beech, sugar maple, white pine, and eastern hemlock. And like I said, comparing the top species by volume to the top species by stem count can tell us a lot about Connecticut's forests, and in particular, how the trajectory of their species composition is changing over time. So in some instances, you can see some similarities in the species composition between these dominant species by volume versus the dominant species by stem count. So red maple, black birch, and white pine are both really abundant in our forests, regardless of which metric we use. And so that's a pretty good indicator that these species are going to stick around, because either there's both very large species in the overstory, along with many, many small species in the understory that are regenerating and ready to replace those older species as they die out. Or there's many mid-sized species that there's just a lot of them, and collectively their volume makes up a large proportion of the volume in the forest. So either way, that's a pretty good indicator that these species are here to stay, at least in terms of the changes in Connecticut's forest composition. But then you can also notice a lot of differences between the top species by volume and the top species by stem count, which can be indicative of how our forests are changing in composition. So most notably, you might see that oaks are the dominant canopy tree species in Connecticut's forests. 68% of Connecticut's forests are classified as the oak hickory forest type. And in Connecticut, that's really mostly oak dominated. So red oak, black oak, and white oak. But you'll notice that even though these species are the dominant overstory species in terms of volume, they're not the dominant species in terms of stem count. So that's indicating that in the future, our forests may be shifting away from this oak hickory forest type. And this is a general trend that's been observed throughout New England and in Connecticut for a long time now, that oak regeneration, or the number of those small oak seedlings that are coming up in the understory of the forest, is declining, despite oak being the dominant species in Connecticut's forests. And that's really a legacy of the land use history in this state. So oak became really dominant in Connecticut's forests because of specific historical land use practices, both by European colonists and by indigenous peoples. So most of you probably know that, of course, during European colonialism, all the forested land was cleared in like the mid-1800s, and so that created a lot of light in the understory, and that enabled oaks to regenerate since they require a lot of light. And similarly, during further back, looking at indigenous practices, there's really widespread use of fire that similarly created really high understory light conditions. And then also we lost a major species in our forest, and that species is the American chestnut. And so that kind of left this gap or niche in the overstory, which those other conditions which promoted oak regeneration in the understory allowed oak to fill and take the place of chestnut as chestnut phased out. So altogether, these different land use practices show that oak is dominant in the overstory today because of these particular practices that increase light in the understory historically. But as our forests continue to mature, those really shady understories in these maturing forests don't recruit oak in the same way, and so our forest composition is shifting away from that oak-dominated forest type. Another major difference that you can see when comparing the top tree species by volume to the top tree species by stem count is in terms of what's recruiting in the understory, in terms of what has the highest number of small individuals. And those are American beech and eastern hemlock and sugar maple. And each of these species shares a trait, and that trait is that they're later successional species. And so unlike oak, which requires a lot of light to recruit in the understory, these later successional species do really well in high shade. And so they're able to grow up in the understory of these maturing forests. And then over time, as the forest develops and the overstory trees die, these are the species that are going to come to dominate and replace those overstory species. And this is a really important point. And that point is that there are different species that dominate in forests at different times during natural forest development. And so there are species, as you can see in this diagram, that are early successional species that are really only present in younger forests. And then there are these later successional species that become more dominant in these older forests. So because of this, that brings me to my second major point in terms of defining forest resiliency. And that's in addition to managing for tree species diversity, we also have to manage for forest age class diversity at the landscape scale. And like I said, these two ideas are very closely connected in that managing for forest age class diversity will promote greater tree species diversity at the landscape scale because different trees do well during these different forest developmental stages. So this is a graph from the Connecticut State Forest Action Plan, which is written every 10 years, and the last draft of it was in 2020, so the next draft will be coming up pretty soon. And this shows the distribution of forest age classes across the state of Connecticut. So you can see that there's really just one dominant forest age class across the state of Connecticut, and that's these kind of middle-aged maturing forests between 60 and 120 years old. And this, once again, is a product of the land use history of forests in Connecticut. That same European colonial land clearing that promoted oak dominance across the forest today also meant that because of that common land use history, all of our forests are kind of the same age and the same species composition. So we're really lacking, we're underrepresented in terms of younger forests and in terms of these older forests. We really just have these middle-aged maturing forests. And a lot of us intuitively know the value of older forests. We hear a lot about old growth forests and why they're so important. And they are really important for a variety of reasons. But it's also not the type of thing that you can kind of snap your fingers and you'll create more older forests. There are different ways to create older forests, both passively by creating forest reserves or actively managing forests to kind of accelerate characteristics that make them closer to older forests. But in both instances, they require at least some amount of time just by the nature of increasing the age of a forest. But like I said, younger forests are also underrepresented currently in terms of the different forest age classes across the state of Connecticut. And younger forests are something that we can actively manage for very quickly and provide a variety of benefits. One of the benefits, like I've already talked about, is that different plant species are associated with these younger forests. And so by managing for younger forests, you're managing for greater forest diversity across the whole landscape. And then you're also managing for oak recruitment, like I already talked about as well. And then younger forests are also really important for creating wildlife habitat. As you can kind of see in this photo, they provide a lot of shelter and forage, and there are many species that rely on these types of younger forests in order to thrive. So managing for younger forests is very important, but it also has a lot of challenges associated with it. And now I'm going to start to talk about some of my research and how it looks at dealing with some of these challenges. So in particular, a lot of my work has focused on invasive plants, so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. These early successional younger forests can be more susceptible to understory plant invasions. And so going back into thinking about how we manage to promote forest resiliency in Connecticut, one of my areas of research looks at ways in which we can promote the recruitment of diverse native understory plant communities and diverse tree regeneration over the dominance of invasive plant species, particularly when we're managing for these, like I said, these younger forests that can be more susceptible to plant invasions. So I'm going to give you a little ecology lesson for a second and talk about some of the factors that promote plant invasions or species invasions in general, and why these forests in Connecticut are particularly susceptible to understory plant invasions right now. And the first major factor is that non-native species have certain traits that tend to do best in conditions that have high levels of resources. So in order to become a successful non-native invasive plant in this region, you have to overcome a lot of barriers. The first of which is establishment, but then you have to do really well and spread and kind of outcompete other plant species. And in order to spread and do really well, plants tend to have traits that mean that they grow really quickly, they photosynthesize really quickly, they spread really quickly, and so that makes them really competitive in conditions in which there's a lot of resources for them to grow and spread. The second factor that contributes to plant invasions is propagule pressure. So in order for an invasive plant to become established and to spread, you literally need to have that plant present nearby. And the higher abundance of that plant that's nearby, whether it's the seeds or the plant itself, the higher abundance of that will increase the susceptibility of the surrounding area to the plant invasions. And then the third factor is the susceptibility of the ecosystem itself to being invaded. And I've already talked about resource availability. Plants have certain traits that enable them to do best in these high resource environments. And so ecosystems that have higher levels of resources, like these younger forests, tend to be more susceptible to plant invasions. And then the last major trait or factor that promotes plant invasions that I've put up here is just what I like to put under a catch-all of novel ecosystem conditions. And that there are some plants that just do really well because we've changed conditions so much across our landscape and made them so different from what the native plants evolved under, that's why they do well. And so the most obvious example that I like to give sometimes is like a very urbanized environment with lots of concrete. Our native plant species didn't evolve under conditions that had those conditions, and so non-native plant species that's from an ecosystem that's more similar to that ends up doing better. So that's just under the catch-all of these novel ecosystem conditions. All right, that's my ecology lesson. Okay, so going back to Connecticut's forests and why they're particularly susceptible to these understory plant invasions, I've already talked to you about just how abundant forests are across the state of Connecticut. That's the forested land is 57% forested, but only about 50% of that land, forested land in Connecticut, is considered these core forests that are greater than 300 feet away from forest edges. And so the forests across the state are very abundant, but they also, for the most part, tend to be very fragmented and in these forest patches. And these forest patches have a lot of edge to them. And then these edges have conditions that often enhance understory plant invasions in these areas. And so these fragmented forest patches and edges all tend to have, once again, higher propagule pressure because they tend to be closer to places like people's yards where they plant non-native species, or they tend to be closer to hiking trails where people might have seeds or whatnot on their boots that they spread. They also tend to have elevated resource availability because they're edge habitat, so there's higher light. And then they can also have those novel ecosystem conditions of just having like really compacted soils, for instance, being adjacent to roads that have concrete or other conditions in which the native plants didn't evolve. So once again, our forests in the state tend to be more fragmented despite the high forest cover, and this can make them more susceptible to these plant invasions. All right, so now I'm going to move on to, if it hasn't gotten depressing yet, and now I'm going to move on to the even more depressing part of the talk, which is talking about some of the different pest and pathogen invasions that are affecting our forests. And once again, tree mortality or tree decline from these different invasive pests and pathogens, just like forest fragmentation or creating early successional forests, it also increases light availability in the understory and can therefore make these forests more susceptible to understory plant invasions. So the two major pests that I'm going to talk about today are emerald ash borer and beech leaf disease. And these two tree species that these pests affect, ash trees and beech trees, they have really different site conditions under which they naturally occur. So emerald ash trees tend to be much more abundant in really fertile sites, versus beech trees tend to be more abundant in drier, less fertile sites. And based on the ecology lesson that I just gave to you all, we would hypothesize that the sites in which the ash do really well would be more susceptible to these understory plant invasions because there's higher both light availability because of the dying ash, but then also higher soil nutrient availability just because those are the natural conditions in which ash trees occur. Versus beech tend to be more dominant, like I said, in these drier and less fertile sites. And so they might be less susceptible to these understory plant invasions, even though we're getting this higher light availability in the understory, just because there's less soil nutrient availability. So first I'll just give a bit of background information about emerald ash borer, which most of you probably have heard of. Raise your hand if you've heard of emerald ash borer. Okay, good. So I'll be quick about this, but this pest has been around for a very long time, and it's been infecting Connecticut and Guilford for a very long time. It was first detected in northern New Haven County in 2012. And has since spread throughout the rest of the state. I think the last detection was in the northeastern corner of the state in maybe 2020 or 2021. But this pest, as you all know, has had really devastating impacts on the ash trees that it affects across the whole eastern U.S. This pest feeds on the one living part of trees, which is between the bark on the outside and then the dead heartwood on the inside. And there's this thin layer of living cells called the cambium, and that's what the emerald ash borer specifically feeds on. And so it basically cuts off those living cells and the supply of water from the soil and nutrients, carbon from photosynthesis by feeding on that layer. So we have another scientist at the Agricultural Experiment Station who's in the entomology department, Dr. Claire Rutledge, who's been monitoring emerald ash borer populations across the state for a very long time. So like I said, it was first detected in northern New Haven County in 2012, and since spread all the way across the state. And some of her recent research has showed that the population peaks after it's first detected, about 3 to 5 years after it's first detected in an area. But more interesting and more promising is the fact that after about 9 years, the population of emerald ash borer has started to crash. So just going back again, this slide shows in the area where it was first detected in northern New Haven County, it shows the populations in green at the peak emerald ash borer levels. And then looking in that same area in northern New Haven County in 2021, you can see that that population has crashed. And so there is some promising hope in terms of the future of ash because these populations have started to crash. And basically they've started to crash because it's not a really good evolutionary strategy to kill off your host tree that you rely on. And so gradually over time, if you lose that host tree, then your populations start to crash. So this brings me to one of my research projects, which won't surprise you at this point, focuses on the factors that promote understory plant invasions following overstory tree mortality from emerald ash borer. And then also a big goal of this project, like I said, is to follow the regenerating cohort of ash seedlings in the understory to see whether they rebound following this crash of emerald ash borer that I just demonstrated in Claire's research. As a side note, this also just illustrates the importance of having these ash trees in different age classes once again, because emerald ash borer devastates these overstory ash trees, but these really small individuals that are coming up in the understory aren't affected by emerald ash borer, and so it could kind of potentially be this future ash resource if it's able to rebound, if the emerald ash borer populations are able to remain suppressed. So in order to address these questions, last summer I set up a network of plots across the state of Connecticut using the data from Dr. Rutledge's work, and I established 81 forest plots across a time since emerald ash borer detection gradient across the state. So once again, you can see in red where it was first detected in northern New Haven County, and then in the bluer colors moving into the northern part of the state where it was detected later. And my hypothesis, we're still working on the data for this, but my hypothesis for this research project is that as the overstory ash trees begin to die, regardless of whether the species in the understory are native or non-native, the increase in light availability from those canopy gaps should increase the growth of both these native species and these non-native species. And then there will be other factors that determine whether understory invasive plants outcompete native regenerating trees in these forests. And for me in particular, one of the factors I'm looking at is soil nutrient availability in addition to just light availability. And because our forests in Connecticut tend to be nitrogen limited, my hypothesis is that sites with higher nitrogen availability will have a higher abundance of invasive plants in the understory compared to sites that have lower nitrogen. But of course, there are a lot of other conditions that have to get checked in order for there to be invasive plants in the understory of these forests. Things like the propagules have to exist. There have to be other invasive plants nearby. And then all the other factors that I talked about as well that increase their susceptibility, things like proximity to roads and paths and nearby houses. But my prediction is that soil nutrient availability will at least be one factor that increases the likelihood that understory invasive plants will become dominant in these forests instead of these native understory plant communities. Okay, moving on to the second major pest that I'm going to be talking about tonight, beech leaf disease. All right, I'll do it again. Once again, how many people have heard of beech leaf disease? All right. So beech leaf disease is very different from emerald ash borer in that it was very recently detected in Connecticut. So it's only been around in Connecticut since 2019. Even though it's been present in Ohio since 2012. It's a foliar nematode that's presumed to be from Japan. And like I said, it was first detected in the Northeast in 2019. And just in the past 5 years, it's already spread super, super quickly. So you can see this is the map. I just got this update like a few weeks ago. So this is the full 2024 map of all the different counties in the U.S. where beech leaf disease has already been detected. And so this is pretty crazy how quickly this disease is spreading, and that in just under 5 years, it's already up into these northern parts of Maine. These same parts of Maine and northern, like middle to northern New Hampshire and Vermont, some of these places still don't even have emerald ash borers. So that just goes to show just how quickly this disease is spreading. The way in which it's spreading is still an open area of research. You can see that it's still not present in southwestern Ohio, even though it was first detected in northeastern Ohio. And so there's at least some thought that it has to do somewhat with prevailing wind, whether the prevailing wind and precipitation is spreading it through these moisture droplets, or whether it's bird patterns that are eating the leaves, that are eating the nematodes, that are migrating according to this wind direction. But there's definitely this trajectory of it going to the northeast and not going to the west or to the southeast, which is kind of interesting. So we have a couple different projects. Like I said, this disease is super new, and so there's just a lot of open questions that are very basic that we don't have answers to about it. So one of the projects that we've initiated is simply monitoring the impacts of beech leaf disease on tree growth and mortality. And we're doing this by using a series of long-term plots that have been monitored for a very long time by different scientists at the Agricultural Experiment Station. So we're doing, and usually we'd only resample these plots like every 5 to 10 years, but we're upping that to annually at this point just because we just don't have basic information about how quickly beech leaf disease is impacting things like tree growth and mortality. So I have some basic data that won't surprise you at all, and from this network of plots looking at the impacts of beech leaf disease on tree growth and mortality. But as you all know, just from driving around and seeing the impacts, beech leaf disease severity has increased dramatically over time, and this has greatly reduced the growth of trees regardless of their size class, so regardless of whether they're in the overstory or in the understory. And that's the graph on the left. You can see that decline in annual growth rate over time. And the 4 different boxes are just the different canopy positions, so whether a tree is in the upper canopy or in the sub-canopy, which is important because this disease is impacting the foliage of trees. If the tree has access to more light, then maybe it would be able to continue growing even under these reduced foliage conditions. And then the other thing that we've observed so far is that despite the really rapid increase in beech leaf disease severity, its impacts on the percentage of normal foliage of trees and its impacts on annual growth rate of the beech trees, we really haven't seen an uptick in beech mortality yet, which is pretty surprising because multiple years of severe defoliation, which is what we've seen so far, trees can really only take so much of that before they can't meet their basic metabolic demands. They need to photosynthesize in order to just stay living as trees. And so we don't know what's going to happen. It's interesting that we haven't seen that uptick in mortality yet. One hypothesis for why we haven't seen that uptick in mortality yet is that beech trees are clonal species. So they're actually all connected underground through their root networks. And so it's possible that basically several overstory beech trees that do get a lot of light are kind of subsidizing these understory beech trees. They're able to maintain a higher photosynthetic rate despite losing some foliage, and they're able to pass on some of those photosynthates or carbon to these understory trees. In which instance we wouldn't expect like gradual mortality. We would really expect the whole stand to reach kind of a tipping point where we see much greater mortality across all these different age classes. So that's one potential hypothesis. So now I'm going to just quickly talk about some of the different management practices that can help promote forest resiliency in the face of some of these really devastating forest pests that we're experiencing. The first one is a bit easier just because it's been around for longer. Are different management practices that we've been using to deal with emerald ash borer. So one is that same scientist who's been doing the emerald ash borer monitoring across Connecticut since it was first detected is also involved in a large biocontrol program. And so she's been releasing parasitic wasps from the native range of emerald ash borer, and they attack the emerald ash borer and kind of keep those populations down. And this is really important because, like I said, in those areas where emerald ash borer was first detected in northern New Haven County, and it killed off all of its host species, we have seen those populations crash. But as that regenerating layer of ash rebounds, it's also very possible that the emerald ash borer could rebound as those trees grow up and that host becomes more available again. So this biocontrol effort is really important because we're hoping that it'll keep those populations down and give potential hope for those smaller ash seedlings to grow up and develop into overstory trees. Some other forest management practices that are more in my area of research involve things just like invasive plant control in these forests because of those different factors that I talked about that make these ash-nominated sites affected by emerald ash borer particularly susceptible to dominance by these understory invasives. And so by doing invasive plant control, you can help promote tree regeneration and forest recovery following overstory ash mortality. And then there are a lot of other forest management practices that involve creating more light.
Attention patrons, the time is now 7:45 and the library will be closing in 15 minutes at 8 o'clock.
There are a lot of other forest management practices that we're implementing as well to kind of increase understory light availability and diversify these forest stands that have been affected by emerald ash borer. Beech leaf disease is harder in terms of management practices that can help promote forest resiliency in the face of it, just because, like I said, it's so new and there's really no treatment that can be employed at the big forest scale. You can get arborists to come to your yard, and if you have a particular landscape tree, there are certain treatments that you can pay for to keep that one tree. But across the whole state of Connecticut, we're not going to apply like pesticides to these trees at that scale. And so this one is a lot harder, and there are a lot of open questions about what's going to happen. It's not looking great, but in terms of our projects, we're starting to initiate some projects just to use different forest management practices to diversify some of these stands. So we have project sites in Connecticut and Rhode Island where we're going to be using different silvicultural treatments, which is just different ways of cutting the forest to promote different light conditions and change the species composition of those forests so that they're not all just beech dominated, because many of the stands right now, because of that clonal growth habit of beech, just tend to be really just dominated by that one species, which makes it not a very resilient forest to just have that one species and not more species. And then similarly, we're doing a smaller scale, more demonstration project in several New Haven parks. Once again, using different forest management practices, including actively planting trees in the understory to try to diversify the stand so that the whole stand isn't knocked out if and when the trees actually do start to die from beech leaf disease. So this brings me to my one main conclusion from this talk, which picks up from what I talked about at the beginning of the talk. But if you were to take away one thing from tonight, it's that in order to manage Connecticut's forests for resiliency, that really involves managing Connecticut's forests for diversity. You shouldn't do the same thing everywhere. Every forest management practice has different trade-offs. And because of that, you really have to use a bunch of different forest management practices in different places in order to diversify species composition, forest structure, and the different ecosystem functions that forests provide at the landscape scale. And this also helps us kind of face the uncertainty of what's the next thing that's going to happen. If we're managing our forests for diversity, not just in terms of species, but also all of these different ecosystem forest functions as well, then we will hopefully have some forests that are more resilient to whatever the next novel stressor is. So that's the one main, if you take one thing away from this talk, this is what I hope it's going to be, is that don't just use one thing, use different management practices in different places. And the last thing, because I do realize that this talk gets a bit bleak during large parts of it, I do want to end on just a lighter note, in that, like I said, last summer I went on my first aerial survey across the state of Connecticut, and it is truly amazing to see Connecticut's forests from the air. It makes you realize how much time we spent driving on the highway and only seeing like the more degraded forests that are right next to the highway. And then there are just these large swaths of beautiful forests that are very diverse, meaning they are very resilient to some of these changes. And so there's a lot of things happening, but we do have a lot of diversity, and we have a lot of great people working on these different forest management practices. And so there is hope. All right, with that, I will take any questions.
I just had a question about the spotted lantern.
Yes.
That has made its way into Connecticut.
Just a general what it is and
What the movement is and what the percentage is.
Yeah, so spotted lanternfly I don't tend to talk about that much in these talks. It's another invasive pest. There are many of them that I didn't talk about. But anyway, it's an invasive forest pest. It was first detected in Fairfield County, Connecticut, as many of the invasive pests have been, just because it's close to New York, and that tends to be kind of a hub for new plant introductions. But spotted lanternfly really doesn't affect a lot of the native tree species in our forests, and so it's considered less of a forest pest. It's really more of an agricultural pest in that it's really bad for the vineyards and attacks grapevines in particular. The one exception, which is interesting, is that spotted lanternfly does really well on one invasive tree species, which is called tree of heaven, and that kind of facilitates the spread of spotted lanternfly that then has these agricultural impacts. And so just to give you another ecology lesson, that's kind of this classic example of this invasion treadmill of you have this one invasive species of this tree of heaven, and then that facilitates the spread of this another invasive species, which is spotted lanternfly. Yes?
I have a house in Newtown, and we have over a number of years had a hemlock blight. And there were a lot of hemlocks in the forest, and they just went, like there's all these dead trees. Is it over? What's going on with that?
Yeah, hemlock has a bunch of different, once again, forest pests that that affect it, and the most notable of which is hemlock woolly adelgid, which is another invasive pest that's been around for a really long time. Unfortunately, it's very rare for these invasive pests to be over for good. It's more whether we can mitigate the damage that they're having. So there's a bunch of other pests that also affect hemlocks, things like hemlock elongate scale, I think is what it's called. And then drought tends to exacerbate the impacts of hemlock woolly adelgid as well. And so maybe it was a particularly droughty year that caused that. But we have another scientist at the station who's also involved, just like the emerald ash borer, but in a big biocontrol program to control the hemlock woolly adelgid populations.
What about the death of Indian laurel?
The what?
Indian laurel.
Indian laurel?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the cause of that. Sorry.
The generalized loss here in the Guilford Wood.
Is it a native species?
Mountain
Oh, mountain laurel.
Yeah.
Oh, the mountain laurel dieback. Mountain laurel was actually what I focused most of my dissertation research on, so that's interesting. I'm not sure what's specifically causing it in the Guilford woods. I have a bunch of ideas in my head, but I don't want to spew ideas without actually knowing. Sorry. Yeah.
I have a stand of about 5 acres of clonal beech on my property, and I've noticed that in the fall, the leaves that fall from the beech have lots of holes in them, and I'm assuming that's the beech leaf.
Beech leaf disease typically doesn't have holes in it, so it might be a different defoliator that's affecting it, because beech leaf disease really is more characterized by the banding of the leaves, because that's the foliar nematodes within the leaves. And then because the leaves aren't able to photosynthesize as well, then they get deformed and kind of like crinkled and then fall off. So I'm not sure.
Got that too, though.
Yeah.
But my
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen a tree without beech leaf disease in Connecticut, so I'm sure it has that too. But I don't know if that's the specific cause of the holes. It's probably a different defoliating insect.
So my question is, like, obviously it's not doing well, and something's got to take its place. And I've heard there's a little bit of controversy where people, some of you folks are kind of advocating for trying to introduce species that do well in, say, Virginia, where it's a little warmer, to set us up for future success. And kind of the old guard is like, no, that's geoengineering. We mustn't. If you had woods that are like mine, would you be taking that track and trying to propagate like trees that do well in Virginia?
Yeah, and of course this is my personal philosophy, which you already saw in my conclusion slide, is that I think we need to try a lot of different things in different places in order to deal with the uncertainty, especially with something like beech leaf disease. And I do think in particular instances, in small areas where we can manage it, doing active restoration with species with
Attention
of a more...
patrons, the time is 7:55 and the library will be closing in 5 minutes at 8 o'clock.
Species with a more southerly distribution, I personally think that that's a good thing to do in certain areas. But as I've said many times, I never think it's best to do everything everywhere. That's gotten us into a lot of forestry problems in the past, is kind of thinking one way is the best way. And so especially, trying different things, I think, is good. I'd probably avoid species that like spread a lot, or like really dominate forests, like maybe some of, I don't know, certain early successional species that could really kind of take over. But I do think that assisted migration of helping those species with more southerly distributions is a viable strategy. Yes?
Does emerald ash borer attack anything other than ash?
It allegedly attacks some other species in the same family, but it doesn't have the same devastating impact. And so white fringe tree is an example of that. It's more of a landscape tree, and then I don't believe, like I said, it actually causes more, like close to 90% mortality like it does for the ash species. Yep.
I have two questions. This wasp that's helping you with the emerald ash borer, do we have to worry about that becoming?
That's a classic biocontrol question. That's a great question. I'm not an entomologist and I'm not a biocontrol expert. There are many other people that work at the station with me that would be much well suited to answer that question. But I do know that they do lots of tests of the potential biocontrol agents before they introduce them. And so one of the big tests is whether it's species specific in terms of the species it attacks, because you don't want to introduce a pest that then kills off a bunch of native insects that are really important to our ecosystems. We want it to be specific to that one pest that it attacks in its native range. And so I don't know the specifics about these parasitic wasps, other than there was a lot of work that certainly went into thinking about that very good question.
Another question is about the elm trees that we had in New Haven. Were they natives, and is any work being done to reforest?
The elm trees, you said? Yes, the American elm is a native species that was affected by yet another, in this case, pathogen, the Dutch elm disease. So the ones that you still see in New Haven, like around the green, are all being treated for the Dutch elm disease. There are lots of forest tree breeding programs focused on creating, for all of these different species, creating individuals that start to be hybridized with species from the native range, of the pest to try to make them resilient to some of these pests and pathogens. And so I'm sure there's a program for elm. There's definitely a program for chestnut, and yeah.
May I ask one more question?
Sure.
Is the beech tree disease affecting European beech?
Yes, it's affecting all the beech trees, yeah. Yes.
Are there any problems with red oak trees?
Yes, but they're not as bad as some of the problems with ash and beech. But the spongy moth that I talked about in the beginning of the presentation, it tends to like to feed on oak foliage the most, and so that oak mortality I showed you in that early slide, that's a potential problem with red oak. Another problem that's not currently present in Connecticut, but has been affects oak trees in the Midwest and Pennsylvania, and has even been found nearby in New York, is oak wilt, and that would be a much more devastating pathogen that would affect red oak, but it's not currently in Connecticut, and we're trying to keep it out.
How are you trying to keep the wilt out?
Lots of early detection and monitoring for it, and working with other states that are doing really good work to, when they do identify oak wilt, they cut the trees down and they quarantine the area and help it not spread. So a lot of collaborative effort. Yeah.
Does the ag station or somewhere else in the thinking of diversity provide saplings of different species so that people could diversify their land?
We used to have a state nursery in Connecticut, but we no longer have a state nursery. So that's a big issue, is seedling supply. Especially there has been historically a lot of investment going into big urban tree planting programs as well, and it's the same thing, is that we're kind of limited in terms of these both urban tree planting programs and restoration projects in the seedling supply. There are other places, of course, you can get seedlings, like and New Hampshire and New York both still have a state nursery where they're very cheap and it's pretty close. Yeah, we no longer have a state nursery in Connecticut. Yep.
That spongy moth, is that different than what we maybe have called the gypsy moth or the tent caterpillar?
Yeah, tent caterpillar is different. Gypsy moth is the former name of spongy moth.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
and sorry. All right. I don't know how much longer you want me to. Okay, I'll try to take one more question and then we can call it an evening. Sorry for the confusion.
I just want to thank you for coming, and this is very informative, and I hope you guys come back and give us more presentations. You know, there's so much to learn here. It's a huge topic, it really is. And I'd like to know more about the parasitic releases and all the, the new species that we're releasing to beat the ones that are killing the trees. And I find that pretty amazing. Like, what if the entomologist can come in and talk to us
you should
a little?
reach out to her. I'm sure she would be happy to do it.
Yeah,
and
that's
it would
really,
be, a very different talk from mine. From
yeah,
that,
you got to
different-
coordinate with the different states, and you got to coordinate, with probably the whole country before we release a new species, an invasive species, into Connecticut.
Yeah, it's
Right.
all a very collaborative effort. Like, a lot of the work I do is all in cooperation with all the surrounding states and the Forest Service, and all of the biocontrol release program is very collaborative.